She escaped her toxic marriage and boarded a plane, not knowing the man beside her was a mafia boss. The terminal buzzed with hurried footsteps and muted announcements, but for Alara, the noise faded into a distant hum. She clutched her small suitcase handle tightly, as if holding onto it could somehow tether her to sanity. Tonight, she was leaving. Leaving the life that had felt more like a cage than a home. Leaving the man who had turned love into chains. Her heart thudded in her chest, a wild drum that refused to be silenced. Every step toward the boarding gate was a step toward freedom, yet fear clung to her like a shadow she could not shake. What if this escape was just the beginning of another storm? What if leaving him meant losing herself entirely? The line moved slowly. Travelers around her laughed or argued quietly on their phones, their expressions untroubled. Ilara envied them, the simplicity of their lives. She longed to feel that ease, to walk into a new place and not feel the weight of a past that tried to follow her like a relentless ghost. Finally, her turn came. She handed her ticket to the attendant, her fingers trembling slightly. She tried to steady herself with a deep breath, inhaling the antiseptic-scented air of the terminal, forcing herself to think of the sky above, the clouds she would soon leave behind. The plane was waiting, sleek and metallic, its lights blinking in the rain like tiny stars trying to pierce the night. Alara stepped aboard and found her seat by the window. She sank into it, letting out a quiet sigh. The cabin hummed softly, the engines a lullaby that promised movement, escape, a blank slate. And then she noticed him. He sat across the aisle, a man whose presence seemed to bend the light in the cabin. He wore dark clothing, simple yet expensive, and carried himself with a quiet confidence that made the hair on the back of her neck rise. There was something dangerous about him, not in an immediate physical threat way, but in the way he seemed to measure the world and her, with eyes that missed nothing. Alara quickly looked away, trying to focus on her own thoughts. She pressed her palm against the cold window, staring at the rain running down the glass in streaks that mirrored the tears she refused to shed. Tonight was her first real night of freedom, yet a strange unease prickled at the edge of her mind. The flight took off, engines roaring as the plane lifted into the stormy sky. Rain turned into clouds, clouds into darkness pierced by distant flashes of lightning. Alara gripped the armrest, not out of fear, but as if grounding herself against a whirlwind she could not yet see. Minutes passed in silence. The man across from her occasionally glanced her way, subtle but deliberate. His eyes were sharp, dark, unreadable. Alara felt an odd pull toward him, a strange curiosity mingling with the instinct to avoid him. Something about his presence felt like a story waiting to unfold, one she was not sure she wanted to be part of. Finally, he spoke, his voice low, measured, almost casual, yet with a weight that made it impossible to ignore. "Rough night," Alara blinked, startled. She had not expected anyone to speak to her, least of all someone so intense. She hesitated before answering, unsure whether to retreat behind politeness or retreat altogether. "Yes," she said simply, "you could say that." He nodded slowly, his gaze softening just enough to reveal a flicker of interest, though the danger in his aura remained. "Flying can be a kind of escape," he said, "or at least a pause." Alara looked out the window again, thinking of the home she had left behind, the life that had suffocated her. "Sometimes I wish it were permanent," she murmured. The man said nothing, but his eyes held a depth that suggested understanding. For a moment the cabin around them disappeared, replaced by a quiet tension that hovered like a fragile thread. Neither spoke, yet each felt the presence of the other, the unspoken acknowledgement of shared shadows. Hours passed, the night stretching endlessly outside the small oval window. Alara dozed lightly, waking to the occasional rumble of turbulence. Each jolt of the plane made her heart leap, her body tense, her mind swirling with questions she dared not voice. Who was he? Why did she feel drawn to him despite the unease curling in her stomach? At one point, the turbulence became more pronounced. The plane dipped sharply, a cold surge of fear washing over her. Her hand flew instinctively to the armrest, fingers gripping the leather as though it could hold her safe. In that moment, the man across from her reached out, his hand steadying the small metal bar beside her. "Easy," he said, calm and commanding, but not unkind. "It's just the storm." Alara looked at him then, really looked. The storm outside seemed to mirror the storm within her, chaotic, wild, unpredictable. And yet there was something in his gaze, a promise she could not name, that made her heart slow just a fraction. As the turbulence eased, a quiet space grew between them. They did not speak, but words were not necessary. The connection was silent yet undeniable, like two threads pulled taut in a tapestry, straining against the dark fabric of the night. Later, when the plane reached a moment of calm above the clouds, Ilara found herself trembling, not from fear, but from a strange anticipation, a tension she could not explain. She wondered if he felt it too, the unspoken pull, the curiosity mingled with caution, the sense that something had shifted in the air between them. She tried to distract herself, focusing on the lights far below, tiny pinpricks that looked like scattered stars fallen to the earth. But every time she stole a glance at him, she felt the invisible thread tighten, a magnetic force she could neither resist nor understand. "Do you travel often?" she asked at last, her voice barely more than a whisper. He considered her question for a moment, his eyes dark pools reflecting the storm outside. "More than most," he admitted. "Some journeys are necessary, others chosen." Ilara's heart skipped. She sensed layers behind his words, hidden truths she could only guess at. Something about him was dangerous, yes, but also strangely protective. And for reasons she could not yet name, she felt herself leaning into that danger, drawn to it like a moth to flame. Hours drifted by in this fragile balance of tension and unspoken understanding. Ilara felt her pulse entwined with the rhythm of the plane, the storm outside echoing the storm inside her. She realized that she had not felt so alive in years, not since the world had turned cold and cruel in her previous life. And yet, with that vitality came a creeping fear. What was she stepping into? As the first light of dawn began to glow faintly on the horizon, the plane shook once more. Turbulence, brief but sharp, jolted the cabin. Ilara's hand slipped slightly from the armrest, and before she could catch it, the man's hand brushed hers. It was accidental, or perhaps not, it was impossible to tell. Her pulse raced, a shiver of awareness coursing through her body. She looked at him and their eyes met. In that moment, the storm outside and the storm inside became one, a collision of fear, curiosity, and something she dared not name. He offered a small, almost imperceptible smile, and Ilara felt the air between them hum with possibilities. She did not know who he was. She did not know the world he carried behind those dark eyes. And yet, for the first time in her life, she felt the thrilling, terrifying sense that she was no longer entirely alone. The plane leveled off, the cabin lights dimmed, and the night stretched on. Ilara pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window, staring at the clouds rolling beneath them like waves of silver. Somewhere across the aisle, the man settled into silence, but she could feel his presence, strong and steady, a shadow that had found its place beside hers. She wondered if she would regret this journey. She wondered if freedom always came with such heavy, unspoken risks. But as the horizon began to brighten with the first hints of day, she made a small, silent vow. Whatever lay ahead, she would not turn back. Not now, not ever. And in the quiet of the plane, high above a storm-tossed world, a new story was beginning, one of danger, of desire, of shadows and secrets, and of a connection neither of them yet fully understood. Ilara closed her eyes, letting the hum of the engines lull her into a restless sleep, unaware that the man across from her was watching her with an intensity that spoke of storms yet to come, of a life that could never be the same, and of a future tethered to her in ways she could not yet imagine. When she woke, the plane would descend into a world where nothing was as simple as it seemed, and the shadow beside her would no longer be just a stranger. The plane touched down with a gentle shudder, the tires screeching softly against the wet runway. Alara felt her stomach twist in anticipation. Her flight into freedom had landed her in a world she did not yet understand. She gathered her suitcase, her fingers gripping the handle like a lifeline, and took a deep breath, tasting the cold, sharp air of a foreign city. She scanned the arrival hall looking for a taxi or shuttle, but before she could step forward she felt it, a presence behind her, familiar yet unexpected. She turned slowly, her heart skipping. The man from the plane was there, his dark coat brushing the floor, eyes fixed on her with that same unreadable intensity. "I didn't think you would follow," she said, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. "I wasn't following," he replied evenly, though there was a faint edge of amusement in his tone. "I just noticed you didn't have a plan." Alara's first instinct was to argue, to claim her independence, but something in the way he spoke, calm yet commanding, made her hesitate. Against her better judgment, she nodded. "You can't just walk into a city without knowing where you're going," he said. "I can take you somewhere safe, at least for now." She studied him carefully. There was no hint of coercion, yet his presence carried power, a silent promise and a quiet warning all at once. She wanted to refuse to run, but the cold, wet night made her consider the offer. Perhaps a few hours of safety wouldn't hurt. "Fine," she said softly. "But just for a little while." The ride was silent at first. The city stretched before them, a labyrinth of neon lights, wet streets and towering buildings that seemed to lean over the cars. Alara watched the rain sliding down the windows, feeling the contrast between the safety inside the vehicle and the world outside. Finally, he spoke. "My name is Lucian," he said. "I think it's only fair you know who you are with." Alara nodded but said nothing. She had already sensed that the man beside her was not ordinary. His presence radiated influence, control, and danger, all qualities she had learned to avoid. Yet she could not deny the magnetic pull she felt toward him. They arrived at a grand mansion, hidden behind wrought-iron gates and tall walls. The building seemed alive, every corner whispering stories of power and secrecy. Lucian led her through the doors, and Alara could not help but feel a shiver of awe and trepidation. "Wait here," he said softly, disappearing down a long, dimly lit corridor. The echo of his footsteps left a hollow silence that wrapped around her like a cloak. Alara wandered the foyer, her eyes drawn to the paintings on the walls, portraits of men and women with hard eyes and proud expressions. She realized they were likely family, past leaders, and perhaps enemies. The air smelled faintly of cedar and candle wax, old and timeless. She felt like an intruder in a world that was not hers. Lucian returned, his expression unreadable. "You may stay here tonight," he said. "In the morning we will decide what comes next." Alara wanted to protest, to assert her independence, but something in his tone brooked no argument. She followed him to a room with tall windows, velvet curtains, and a bed that seemed impossibly large for one person. "This will do for now," he said. "I'll leave you to rest." And with that he turned and left, the door closing with a finality that left her alone with her thoughts. Alone, Alara allowed herself to think. She thought of her old life, the marriage that had drained her spirit, the whispered insults and cold silences that had made her feel invisible. She thought of the plane, of the storm, of the man beside her, and the strange sense of safety she felt despite the danger that seemed to cling to him. Sleep came reluctantly, heavy with unease and anticipation. When she awoke, sunlight streamed through the tall windows, painting the room in soft gold. She dressed quickly, determined to take the first steps of freedom on her own terms. Lucian was already waiting outside her door. His presence was calm yet commanding, as if he had been expecting her even before she woke. "Morning," he said simply. "I trust you slept well." Alara gave a small nod. "As well as I could." He studied her silently, eyes dark pools reflecting thoughts she could not read. "We need to talk," he said finally. "About you, about me, about the world you've stepped into." Alara felt her stomach tighten. She knew deep down that this world was dangerous, but she could not resist the pull of curiosity. She nodded. "I'm listening." Lucian led her through the mansion, halls lined with portraits and artifacts, each telling a story of power, wealth, and influence. He spoke carefully, choosing his words with precision. "My world is not like yours," he said. "There are rules you don't know, dangers you cannot imagine. I protect what is mine and I demand loyalty, but I also respect courage and honesty." Alara listened, absorbing every word. She did not yet fully understand his world, but she sensed its gravity. And she sensed something else, a vulnerability hidden beneath the surface of his control, a man shaped by power but haunted by the past. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because I see something in you," he said quietly. "Strength, a refusal to be controlled. A fire that mirrors my own." Alara's heart thudded. She had spent so long hiding, blending into shadows, that the idea of being seen, truly seen, by anyone was both terrifying and exhilarating. They spent the day together, though not in the way one might expect. He showed her the mansion, its hidden rooms and secret passages, the library filled with ancient texts and maps, the gardens where shadows danced under the sunlight. And through it all, there was an unspoken tension, a dance of proximity and distance, curiosity and caution. Alara felt drawn to him in ways she could not name. She wanted to understand him, to see beyond the darkness, but she also feared the consequences of stepping too close. At dinner, the mansion was quiet, save for the soft clink of silverware and the distant hum of the city outside. They sat across from each other, a careful distance maintained, yet every glance carried weight. "You could leave," he said finally, his voice low and steady. "You don't belong here, not really." Alara looked down at her hands. "And if I stay," she whispered, "then you will have to choose carefully," he said, "because nothing in this world is simple, and nothing in my world can be ignored." The words lingered between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Alara felt a shiver run down her spine. She was free, yes, but she had stepped into a world where freedom was complicated, where power and danger intertwined, where every choice carried weight. Night fell over the mansion, and with it came a quiet storm outside. Rain tapped against the windows like tiny drums, echoing the tension in Alara's chest. She stood by the window, looking at the city lights blurred by the rain. She felt a strange mix of fear and longing, excitement and hesitation. Lucian appeared behind her without a sound. She did not turn, but she could feel his presence, strong and steady, like a shadow that refused to leave. "You are thinking too much," he said softly. Alara turned to face him, eyes wide. "And you?" she asked. "Are you always so calm?" He smiled faintly, a curve that did not quite reach his eyes. "Calm is a tool," he said. "Like power, like fear, like trust." She studied him, sensing the truth in his words. He was a man shaped by forces she could barely imagine, yet there was a depth there, a complexity that drew her in despite herself. Hours passed, and the mansion grew quiet. Alara lay awake, listening to the storm outside, thinking of the man who had become both her protector and her mystery. She wondered what his story was, what shadows he carried, what losses he had endured. And she wondered, despite her better judgment, whether she could face the world beside him, rather than alone. The night was long, heavy with questions, with possibilities, with the tension of two lives poised on the edge of connection and danger. As dawn broke, Alara made a silent vow. She would not run from this world. She would not hide from the man beside her, no matter how dangerous, no matter how complex. She had survived one storm. She could survive another. And somewhere in the mansion, in the quiet spaces between shadows and light, Lucian watched her with a careful intensity. a man who understood the weight of freedom, the pull of desire, and the fragile strength of a woman who refused to be broken. The day ahead promised challenges, revelations, and tests neither of them could yet imagine. And as they prepared to face it together, a quiet tension settled over them, an unspoken promise, a warning, and a spark of something that might, just might, change both their lives forever. The mansion was quiet in the morning light, yet Alara could feel the weight of its secrets, pressing against her senses. Every hallway, every shadowed corner seemed to hum with stories she could not yet hear. Lucian moved through it all with a natural authority, as if the house itself obeyed his commands, bending silently around him. Alara had not slept well. The storm from the previous night had left the city wet and glistening, and the distant sounds of traffic were muted under the soft drizzle. She dressed quickly, pulling her hair back into a loose braid, her mind restless with questions she did not know how to ask. Lucian entered the library just as she was finishing breakfast. His presence filled the room like the shadows that clung to the corners. He gestured to a chair across from him. "We need to talk," he said. There was no impatience in his tone, only quiet gravity. Alara took a seat, gripping the edge of the chair as if it could anchor her courage. "About what?" she asked. "About me," he replied simply. "About the life you've stepped into and the choices that will define the days ahead." She braced herself. Somehow she had expected danger, intrigue, perhaps even the hint of violence, but the words he spoke carried weight she could not have imagined. "My world," Lucian began, "is not one for ordinary people. It is built on loyalty, on rules that are unspoken, and on burdens I inherited long before I came to understand them." Alara's curiosity pricked at her. "Burdens?" she asked. "Yes," he said, leaning back in his chair. "A curse in a way. My family has carried it for generations. Betrayal, loss, death, they follow those who are born into it. I have always believed love is impossible because it can bring ruin to anyone who dares to care for me." Alara swallowed hard, the weight of his words pressing against her chest. "And yet," she said quietly, "you protect people anyway." Lucian's gaze softened, though only just. "Protection is different from trust. Protection can be calculated. Trust, that requires risk." She nodded slowly, understanding the invisible chains that had shaped him. And yet, despite the danger, despite the shadows that clung to his life, she felt a flicker of something forbidden, a desire to step closer, to understand him, to defy the rules that both bound and protected them. The morning passed in uneasy silence. Lucian showed her hidden corners of the mansion, rooms filled with objects of power and memory. A library of ancient texts whispered secrets of alliances, betrayals, and strategies that had shaped his family for centuries. A gallery of portraits told stories of ancestors who had lived and died under the weight of the same curse. Alara felt a mixture of awe and fear. She had entered this world as a stranger, yet it was beginning to feel alive, and she realized with a shiver that she was already a part of it. At noon, Lucian led her into the gardens. Rain had left the flowers glistening, and the air smelled faintly of wet earth and blooming jasmine. Shadows stretched along the paths, long and deliberate, as if the garden itself was watching them. "Why show me all this?" Alara asked, her voice soft. "Because you need to understand the stakes," Lucian replied. "Knowledge is power, and you will need both if you intend to survive here." She nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. She watched the way he moved, controlled, precise, yet somehow gentle in his attention to the small details of the garden. And in the midst of the tension, she felt a flicker of something dangerous and exciting, a desire to be closer to him, to breach the walls he had built around himself. Their conversation shifted to lighter topics, tentative at first. They spoke of books, of dreams, of things that had nothing to do with power or danger. For a moment, Alara allowed herself to forget the shadows, to imagine a life where connection and trust could exist without peril. But the calm did not last. Late in the afternoon, Lucian's phone rang, its sharp tone cutting through the quiet. He answered, his expression hardening immediately. Words were exchanged in low, urgent tones, and when he hung up, his eyes were storm-dark. "We have visitors," he said simply. "Enemies. Old debts, people who do not forgive or forget." Alara felt her stomach twist. She had stepped into a world of danger, and now it was confronting her. She wanted to flee, but she also knew that she could not turn away. Not now. Not when the man beside her was standing on the edge of something she could not yet understand. Lucian moved with swift precision, checking locks, signaling to unseen guards, and ensuring the mansion's defenses were ready. Yet through it all, there was a moment when he turned to her, his eyes softening. "You are safe here," he said. "I promise you that." Alara wanted to believe him. She wanted to feel the comfort of his presence, the strange protection that only someone like him could provide. And yet a part of her wondered what price came with that safety, what secrets he had yet to reveal. As night fell, the tension in the mansion grew palpable. Candles flickered, shadows danced across the walls, and the rain continued to drum softly against the windows. They dined together in silence, the only sounds the clink of cutlery and the distant murmur of the city beyond the walls. After dinner, Lucian led her to a small study lined with books and maps. He sat across from her, his eyes studying her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "There is something I must tell you," he said quietly. "About the curse, about my family, about why trust is so difficult for me." Alara leaned forward, captivated despite herself. She wanted to hear everything, to understand him fully, even if it meant facing the shadows he carried. "The curse," he began, "is not just about danger. It is about consequence. Every choice my family makes echoes across generations. Loyalty is tested, betrayal punished. Love can be the most dangerous of all." She felt a chill. "And yet," she said softly, "you have shown me kindness. You have shown me protection. You have allowed me to exist in your world." Lucian's eyes met hers, and for a moment the walls around him seemed to crumble. "I allow very few people in," he said. You are different. I do not know why. Perhaps it is your courage, perhaps your fire, perhaps it is simply fate." Alara's heart thudded. The connection between them was electric, silent yet undeniable. She wanted to reach out, to bridge the space between them, but caution held her back. She knew the dangers, the rules, the curse, and yet the pull was irresistible. Hours passed and the mansion grew quiet. Lucian left her in the study, his presence lingering like a shadow at the edges of her awareness. She walked to the window, watching the rain blur the city lights. She felt alive and terrified and utterly drawn into a world she had only begun to understand. Suddenly, a noise from outside shattered the fragile calm. Footsteps, deliberate and heavy, echoed through the hallways. Alara froze, her pulse spiking. She did not know whether it was danger or a test, but instinct told her to stay still. Lucian appeared beside her in an instant, silent as a shadow. He placed a hand lightly on her shoulder, a grounding touch that sent warmth through her chest. "They are here," he whispered. "Stay behind me." The footsteps grew louder, closer, echoing through the mansion like the march of inevitability. Alara felt fear coil in her stomach, but also a strange thrill. She was no longer merely a spectator in her own life. She was part of a world where danger and desire intertwined, where every choice carried weight, and where the man beside her held both her safety and the storm she could not resist. Lucian moved with precise, controlled power, leading her away from the main halls, deeper into the hidden corridors of the mansion. They passed rooms she had never seen, passages that seemed to twist and turn impossibly, until finally they reached a secluded chamber. He turned to her, eyes dark and unreadable. "You are safe," he said, "for now." Alara nodded, though her chest heaved with both fear and anticipation. "For now?" she asked. He smiled faintly, a shadow of humor in the darkness. "The world is never safe," he said, "but we survive. Together, perhaps, we can even endure." The words hung in the air, heavy with promise and peril. Alara felt a shiver run down her spine. She did not know what the future held, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Her life had changed, irrevocably, the moment she had stepped onto that plane. And the man beside her, dangerous, enigmatic, and achingly compelling, was the reason she could no longer turn back. As the night deepened, rain still drumming softly against the windows, Alara realized that her journey was only beginning. The storm within Lucian, the curse that haunted him, and the shadows of his world were vast, but so too was the pull between them. And in that pull, she felt something new, the first spark of courage to face both the darkness and the desire she could no longer deny. The mansion was quiet as dawn crept slowly over the city. Rain had passed, leaving streets wet and glistening, reflecting the muted gold of the early sun. Alara stood by the large window of the secluded chamber where she had spent the night, her hands pressed lightly against the cool glass. Outside, the world seemed peaceful, but inside her chest, a storm still raged. Lucian entered silently, as he always did, and stopped a few feet away. The shadow of his presence filled the room, but there was something different about the morning light. The hardness in his eyes softened just slightly, and the air between them hummed with unspoken truths. "Morning," he said, his voice low but steady. Alara turned to face him. "Morning," she replied, though her voice carried a weight of anticipation. Today would be different, she could feel it. Lucian approached slowly, hands tucked behind his back, his expression unreadable. "We have to face what is coming," he said. "It cannot be avoided. The curse, the enemies, it all leads here." Alara nodded, though fear gripped her briefly. She had spent days learning about his world, about the power and danger that surrounded him, and now she understood that running was no longer an option. Courage had replaced fear in her heart, though the tension between them remained, sharp and thrilling. "I'm ready," she said quietly. "Whatever comes, we face it together." Lucian studied her for a long moment. "Together," he repeated, as if tasting the word. Then he nodded. "Good, then we begin." The mansion itself seemed to react to their resolve. Doors that had felt heavy and forbidding now opened easily, hallways stretched endlessly with purpose, and shadows retreated as they walked through the familiar corridors. Lucian led her to the grand hall, where he often held meetings that determined the fate of his family's influence. "You must understand," he said as they entered, "the people we face are cunning and dangerous. They will test both your courage and my control. But I have faith in you and in us." Alara took a deep breath, letting the words settle. She felt the pull of responsibility, the gravity of their situation, but also the strange exhilaration of being part of something larger than herself. For the first time in years, she did not feel powerless. The first challenge came swiftly. A knock at the massive front doors echoed through the hall, deliberate and forceful. Lucian's eyes darkened, and he gestured for Alara to stay behind him. Guards appeared almost instantly, silent as shadows, and yet the tension in the room remained electric. Lucian opened the doors a fraction, enough to peer through. "State your business," he demanded, his voice calm but commanding. A man stepped forward, well-dressed, polite, but with an unmistakable edge of authority. "Lucian," he said smoothly, "we have unfinished business. Your family owes a debt that cannot be ignored." Lucian's jaw tightened. "I know the debts," he said evenly. "But threats will not work here. Leave or face consequences." The visitor smiled faintly, eyes glinting with amusement. "Consequences are often unavoidable, aren't they?" Alara watched the exchange in silence, her heart thudding. Danger was no longer abstract. It was here at the doors of the mansion, and Lucian faced it without hesitation. She realized in that moment how much he carried, not just power, but the weight of responsibility, the burden of legacy, and the constant shadow of potential betrayal. The visitor's smile faded as Lucian signaled to his guards. The confrontation ended quickly, efficiently, without a single violent act, but the tension lingered in the air like smoke. Alara felt both fear and awe. Lucian had faced the storm and held his ground, his calm and control making the threat powerless. After the visitor left, Lucian turned to her. "You saw that," he said. "This is only the beginning. There will be tests, there will be danger, and there will be choices that could change everything." Alara nodded. "I'm not afraid," she said. She wanted to believe it, and in her heart she did. She had faced fear before, and she had survived. Lucian's expression softened slightly, a rare break in his stoic demeanor. "Good," he said. "Courage will be necessary, but so will trust." They spent the rest of the day preparing, studying maps, reviewing messages, and planning for the challenges ahead. Alara learned quickly, absorbing his strategies and insights, understanding how the world of power, loyalty, and danger worked. And through it all, their connection deepened, not through words alone, but through the quiet understanding of shared purpose, the unspoken bond of trust, and the subtle, charged moments that spoke louder than any declaration. As night fell, the mansion seemed alive with anticipation. The rain returned softly, a gentle patter against the windows, and the halls glowed with candlelight. Lucian and Alara stood together in the grand hall, reviewing the final details before confronting the true threat that lurked outside their walls. "You've changed," Lucian said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "Since the moment you stepped into my world, you've grown." Alara felt a blush rise to her cheeks, though she tried to hide it. "I had to," she admitted. "There was no other choice." He studied her, eyes dark and intent. "And yet you are stronger than I expected, more than I deserve to have by my side." The words hung in the air, heavy with emotion. Alara wanted to speak, to bridge the space between them, but the night demanded focus, and the world outside the mansion's walls was waiting. The confrontation came soon after midnight. Shadows moved along the perimeter of the mansion, shapes that were both human and threatening. Lucian and Alara stood side by side as the first challenge arrived, a group of men who tested the defenses and sought to uncover weaknesses. The encounter was tense, but careful. Lucian moved with calculated precision, directing guards and anticipating moves. Alara followed his instructions, her mind sharp and alert, her courage steady. She realized that she was no longer the woman who had fled her past life. She had become someone capable, someone who could face fear and still act with clarity. After the threat passed, they stood together in the quiet halls, catching their breath. The mansion felt peaceful again, yet the night had changed them both. Alara felt the bond between them solidify, a connection forged in tension, trust, and the recognition of shared strength. Lucian turned to her, his expression soft but intense. "You stayed," he said quietly. "Even when it was dangerous, even when you could have left, that means more than you know." Alara's heart thudded. "I stayed because of you," she admitted softly. "Because of what I feel." His eyes darkened with emotion, the careful walls around him trembling just slightly. He stepped closer, and for a moment the world outside ceased to exist. Shadows, danger, and curse melted into a fragile, electrifying stillness. "You could leave at any moment," he said, voice low, "and yet you remain. That courage, it mirrors my own desire for something more than control, more than power, for trust, for connection." Alara reached out, her hand brushing against his. The touch was fleeting, yet it carried a world of meaning. "Then we face it together," she whispered. And together they did. The final challenge of the night was not a physical battle, but a confrontation with the past, a message delivered to Lucian from someone long thought gone. Shadows of betrayal, family secrets, and consequences threatened to unravel everything. But this time, Lucian and Alara faced it as a team, their combined courage, intelligence, and trust allowing them to navigate the threat without harm. As dawn approached, the mansion was quiet once more. Lucian and Alara stood in the gardens, the rain having left the flowers sparkling, their scent heavy in the crisp morning air. They were soaked from the storm, yet neither cared. "You've changed me," Lucian admitted quietly. "You've shown me that trust is possible. That connection is worth the risk." Alara felt her chest swell with emotion. "And you've changed me," she said. "You've shown me that courage isn't just surviving, it's standing for something, even when the world is against you." They stood in silence for a moment, letting the dawn wash over them, the mansion and city around them fading into quiet background. The storm had passed, but its lessons remained. Courage, trust, and the willingness to face shadows together had transformed them both. Finally, Lucian reached out, taking her hand in his. "We are both broken," he said softly, "but together we are stronger, free, perhaps even whole." Alara squeezed his hand, a small smile touching her lips. "Then let's face the future together," she whispered. And in that moment, with the first rays of sun illuminating their world, they stepped forward, toward freedom, toward trust, and toward a bond that had been forged in darkness, tested by storms and tempered by courage. The mansion, the city, the curse, and the shadows, they no longer controlled them. For the first time, Alara and Lucian understood that power and love, danger and desire could coexist, and that redemption was possible, even in the most shadowed of worlds. And as they walked side by side into the morning light, the world seemed to shift. A world where the past could not dictate the future, where the storm had passed, and where two souls, once alone in their struggles, had found each other, unbroken, unafraid, and free.